Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm Stephen Pfeiffer. I'm a William Perry Fellow here at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. And I will be introducing and moderating today's discussion of the European Security Initiative series, where we're going to talk about how the current crisis between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO has seen in London. Now, the crisis seemed to reach something of a crescendo over the weekend, with a Russian military buildup continuing, and President Biden yesterday said there were now 150,000 Russian troops arrayed around Ukraine in Crimea, Belarus, Russia proper, and also aboard the Black Sea Fleet. On Friday, the US government said it saw a significant risk of a Russian military attack. It ordered or recommended that American citizens leave, and it moved the American embassy contingent, a skeleton crew, from Kyiv to Lviv. Now, yesterday, the Russians said that they had begun withdrawing some units, although at least as of this morning, both Washington and NATO have said that they have yet to see those withdrawals. On the diplomatic path, it looked like on Monday, the Kremlin left the door ajar, and then it seemed to widen it a bit yesterday following the meeting between President Putin and German Chancellor Scholz. And the Russians now are talking about picking up on some of the offers from the West with regards to arms control issues and risk reduction, though the Russians still insist that there must be a discussion of what they call their two key demands, one of which is that NATO forswear any further enlargement, and the second of which is that NATO withdraw forces from the territory of those allies who joined the alliance after 1997. Now, through this crisis, Britain has been a key American ally. Britain has had a fairly tough stance towards Russia in recent times. And I'm delighted, therefore, that to discuss the British government's view and its perspectives, we have Sir Roderic Lyne here with us today. Sir Roderic had 34 years in Her Majesty's diplomatic service. That included 3 tours at the British Embassy in Moscow, including from 2000 to 2004. He was the British ambassador there. I first met him in the early 1990s when he was the head of the Soviet desk. In 1991, they had to change the name after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I do recall that when it was still the Soviet desk or the Soviet department at the Foreign Office, he wrote a very detailed and prescient memo about the coming collapse of the Soviet Union. He also served as the advisor to Prime Minister Major on foreign affairs, security in Northern Ireland. And since his retirement, after his tour was completed in 2004 in Moscow, he's made more than 50 visits back to Russia. So this is somebody who has a deep wealth of knowledge about Russia. And I'm delighted he's taking the time, particularly at 9 o'clock in the evening in London, to join us. So Roderic will offer some opening comments. I will then invite people to pose questions and nays. Please use the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So, Sir Roderic, thank you again for joining us, especially at this late hour. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve, and good evening, everybody, from a rather wet but fairly warm London, where it is indeed very dark outside. We're at an interesting point in this protracted crisis. As one of the Russian commentators put it the other day, the gun is really loaded, but we don't know if it's going to go off. And today was one of the days when it was forecast to go off. People here are, many of them, hanging on these stories that the Russians may be withdrawing some forces, but the NATO Secretary General has said very clearly that NATO have not, at this point, seen any sign of de-escalation. Whatever happens over the next few days, we are essentially just at another phase in a campaign of coercion and confusion, which has been building up almost for the past year, and certainly through last fall and now into the last couple of months. I want to look at this under 4 subheads. Firstly, why is this happening now? What are Putin's objectives? And I would divide his objectives into 3 parts. There is always with Putin a domestic and personal agenda. His own personal survival in power is the most important factor in his life. He has never managed in 22 years as Russian president to develop a succession plan in which he can trust. He knows that his legitimacy is highly questionable. He has increasingly, over the last 2 or 3 years, turned the screws tighter, taken more and more repressive measures in order to maintain control. So it's very important to him to work out how this plays in Russia with the people who support him, but also more widely across the country. There are some Russian commentators, including General Ivashov, who wrote a rather dramatic letter criticizing Putin's policy the other day, who are arguing that Putin has actually engaged in this campaign in order to divert attention from the failure of his domestic policies, from the very poor state of the Russian economy, which is causing quite a lot of discontent. I'm not sure I go all the way with that, but there's a factor in there. There are other commentators in Russia who've described this as Putin's last stand, saying that he's really now thinking very hard about his legacy. He's going to be 70 in October of this year. The state of his health is something that we never know about. You can only guess at. But he's no longer a young man. He's got 2 years to the next presidential, quote, election, unquote, and much uncertainty as to whether he will stay for the next 14 years beyond that, by which time he would, of course, be 86. But there is this notion that Putin, before he leaves or gets carried out, wants to coin a phrase, make Russia great again. So that's the sort of personal and domestic. Secondly, and I think most importantly, is the core objective of Russian foreign policy is to protect the sphere of influence that it claims within the territory of the former Soviet Union. When Putin gave his press conference on the 23rd of December, he was repeating this point, though interestingly, he talked about 12 former Soviet republics, not 15. So he is explicitly acknowledging that the Baltic states are outside that sphere. But there is one very big, very important missing piece in this sphere of influence. He's got Belarus exactly where he wants it. Georgia now is no longer a problem. Armenia, Moldova have Russian bases. Kazakhstan has to call for Russian help when it has demonstrations. But Ukraine is clinging on to its independent sovereignty. And for 17 years now, Putin, since the Orange Revolution, has been trying to assert strategic control over Ukraine. He doesn't want to run the country. I don't think he wants to incorporate it directly into the Russian Federation. I think he would like to have it as part of this Eurasian Union with Russia and Belarus and Kazakhstan. But the critical point is he wants the power of veto over strategic decision-making in Ukraine. And for 17 years, he has failed to get that. This is a serial failure by Putin. For the past 8 years, his forces, in various ways, covertly, semi-covertly, have been fighting a low-intensity war on the borders of Ukraine. But Ukraine has not collapsed. He has not managed to bring Ukraine to heel. In fact, in that time, Ukraine has continued to drift westward. So he, in my estimation, has decided that it is now time to bring this to a head. And I think he's chosen this time because he sees a window of opportunity. He sees internal fragility within Ukraine. Zelensky, not a very strong president. Zelensky also fighting battles with people like his predecessor, Poroshenko, who he is at the moment prosecuting, with some of the oligarchs like Akhmetov, continuing arguments within Ukraine over the language issue and so on. And then Putin, staring out from the Kremlin, sees a West which is divided, or looked divided, and basically looked weak. United States, preoccupied with internal issues, heavily preoccupied with China, and seemingly in a period of relative decline. Likewise, Europe, with significant differences. Brexit, of course, has not helped European unity one little bit. Significant differences within Europe a new German coalition headed by a relatively weak-looking figure, a French president who's running for re-election. And then critically, Putin has got the passive support of his senior partner, President Xi in Beijing, who he has met no fewer than 36 times. That, I think, is absolutely vital to Putin because Russia is very isolated in the world, but to have the world's currently arguably most powerful country, or most powerful country, publicly approving his actions, I think was very important to secure his rear. So that's the Ukraine part of the objective, and I would put that really at the top of my list. But then there is a third bunch of issues, which I would call issues of status and security architecture. Putin's generation, and particularly those who served in the KGB and in the Soviet armed forces, many of them are infected with paranoia about Western plans to dismember Russia. They have in their DNA an inbuilt hostility to the West, suspicion of the West. Putin, after all, was nearly 40 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Patrushev, very close collaborator who often talks about the West trying to dismember Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union having been plotted by the CIA. There is this level of paranoia. We saw it again in Putin's press conference on the 23rd of December. And one remembers that George Kennan, your wonderful chargé d'affaires in Moscow back in 1946, who wrote the famous long telegram, commented then that at the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is a traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Now, Putin himself is a very insecure individual. We've seen this in the way he's been petrified of COVID. He's put himself into near isolation and he meets people on a table that's 20 meters long. You see this when Putin has to stage ice hockey matches, which are fixed so that his team can win by 18-9 and he can score 7 goals. I mean, if he was a confident leader, he wouldn't have to employ tricks like that. You see this in his obsession with his personal security, which people have always remarked on in Moscow. You see it in trivial episodes like the order that was given to Russian editors that nobody was to comment on Putin's thinning hairline. He is an insecure man, and he knows, as I say, that the foundations of his legitimacy are pretty shaky. If you sit in Moscow and you look at the colors on the map, then the bits of Europe that are colored NATO have advanced towards Russia. And if you start with a paranoid and anti-Western perspective, and you're not actually looking too hard at whether NATO is a genuine threat to Russia, which it clearly isn't, then you can start to feel a bit concerned that NATO is moving ever closer to Russia's borders. And so I think there is a genuine wish, though I don't think it's the prime factor, to roll NATO back to the extent possible. But if the Russians seriously believe that there is the remotest possibility of NATO going back to the status quo ante of May 1997, I mean, that is completely non-negotiable, and they must surely know that. Another element in this mix is the sense of victimhood that Putin plays on, that the West took advantage of Russian weakness in the 1990s, of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and excluded Russia from Europe's security architecture. That has been a long-running theme with Putin. And then there's another element of yearning, once again, to have some respect in the world, to be recognized as a great power by the United States, to have American presidents who will meet you and talk to you as an equal. And of course, within that, there is also a yearning, if only it could be achieved, for a sort of recrudescence of the Yalta Agreement, under which America and NATO would recognize a sphere of Russian influence. Then another factor here, I think, is that since 2007, the Russian government has been investing very heavily in rebuilding its military, which for about 20 years up to that point had been starved of investment. And it's made a lot of progress, even though its defense budget is still only, I think, about a tenth of that of the United States. But they have now got to the point where I think there is a sense in Moscow that Russia can use this muscle, rather in the manner of a 19th century power, to readjust the post-1991 order, to readjust the balance of power in Europe, simply by pushing in this rather aggressive, rather crude way, seeking a return on this investment in hard power. And then moving further beyond that, I think one can detect somewhere in this, perhaps, an attempt by Russia and China to adjust the global balance of power, to move from the rules-based international order that we have helped to build since 1945, that we have defended since 1945, to a power-based order in which China and Russia can occupy larger spaces and behave much as they like at a time when, as I say, the USA and Europe are distracted and in decline. Let me move from the objectives now into my second theme, which is Putin's tactics. The first point that we have to recognize is that Putin is the sole decision maker in Moscow on matters of war and peace. He doesn't have to consult a cabinet, a Congress, a parliament. It rests ultimately with him, and nobody ever knows exactly what goes on inside his head. I don't believe he has a fixed plan. I think he is a calculating opportunist. He's a tactician, not a strategist. He's very practiced in concealing his intentions. And he may himself not know at this point what his next move is going to be. I remember that Stalin once said in a quiet moment to Anastas Mikoyan, I don't trust anybody, not even myself. And I think that's probably true of Putin, and I doubt if he's trusted anybody with his plans. He has options. He likes to have options. He has variants. But what he is doing, and what he has been doing, certainly since the 17th of December, when Russia handed over its quasi-ultimatum to the United States and NATO, is deliberately creating maximum confusion, making very visible preparations for a full-scale war, a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and at the same time constantly saying, day after day, that Russia does not intend to invade. I think he's testing out the opposition. I think he's deliberately keeping people in doubt. Within that, I would define two main vectors of this campaign of coercion. The first clearly is to continue to try to destabilize Ukraine, destabilize it clearly with the pressure of this threat of invasion, but also with internal subversion by mobilizing pro-Russian elements in Ukraine, by heavy use of information warfare, by cyber attacks, and we've just seen another one, by economic pressure, potentially by sabotage. And the other vector is to disrupt and divide the West, to put pressure on the United States, which is something of a pincer movement with China. Poor President Biden has got to look in two directions at once, trying to scare Germany with the threat of cutting off Russian gas from Germany, and indeed with pressure on the German business community, Russia being one of its largest export markets, and pressure on this new, not very well established leadership in Germany. Different tactics with France. I think with France, it's more a question of seduction. Have Macron to a 5-hour meeting. Of course, Putin has, again, because of his insecurity and desperate need to show he's the boss, he has to keep Macron waiting for 90 minutes, just as he once kept Condi Rice sitting outside the gates of his dacha for a couple of hours in the dark. It's a little Putin trick. But basically trying to play along with Macron's desire as he runs for election to be seen as the leader of Europe, as building Europe's strategic autonomy, and as possibly the person who could broker some kind of a negotiation. As for the UK, the tactic is very clear: marginalize the UK. We've always tended to be the hardest line player in NATO, other than the United States. We make the biggest European contribution to NATO, but we have now parted from the European Union. We've already marginalized ourselves, and we have a prime minister who is perceived around the world to be clinging on to power by his fingernails. So try to ignore the UK, try to humiliate the British foreign minister, who is very new in the job, and who was born after Lavrov actually became started his diplomatic career when she goes to Moscow. Throughout all of this, you sustain a credible threat of invasion and you keep raising the ante. And I think this will be the tactic that we see from now on in different ways. This could be a very protracted process of raising the ante until either Ukraine folds or the West cracks and sells Ukraine out. Let me now turn to the Western response. Perhaps I can quote George Kennan again. Soviet power, he wrote, is impervious to the logic of reason, but highly sensitive to the logic of force. For this reason, it can easily withdraw, and usually does, when strong resistance is encountered at any point. Well, I'd say of the Western reaction, so far so good. The coordination between the United States and NATO partners in Europe has been very good, indeed considerably better than I might have expected, and I think better probably than Mr. Putin anticipated. Putin has actually helped to reunite and reinvigorate NATO, and he has produced precisely the reverse effect of what he wanted, or what his generals wanted, and what is perhaps arguably in Russia's interests. That is to say, he has triggered a reinforcement by NATO of its eastern flanks, and that reinforcement continues, and there are plans to take it to another stage. I think the response that was given in writing to Russia's quasi-ultimatum was well crafted. I don't know who drafted this in the White House, but I think it was very well put together, and essentially it fell into three parts. We, NATO, United States, said we were ready to discuss European security and strategic stability, and that of course would be in the interests of both sides if Russia is interested in pursuing that subject. Secondly, we made very clear that NATO's open door policy is not negotiable, but on the other hand, NATO stands ready to improve and rebuild its relations with Russia. And thirdly, and absolutely critically, we underlined that Ukraine's sovereignty is not negotiable, while recognizing that the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia needs to be settled. There was a glancing reference to the draft agreements made at Minsk, but of course they are not operable in their current form. Now, talking does not mean conceding. I think it's been very important that the Western side did give Russia that response and has been prepared to talk to Moscow. I think that's critical to maintaining the solidarity of the alliance. It's very, very important for public opinion in Europe, which is not in all quarters totally robust. And simply telling the Russians to take a running jump, which was a temptation when one read their ridiculous documents of the 17th of December, I think would have been a tactical mistake on our part. Finally, where do I think it goes from here? Well, Russia has not at any point yet rejected diplomacy. Indeed, explicitly, Putin has said, Lavrov has said, that there is enough in this for Russia to want to continue talking. At the same time, we certainly have no assurance that they won't carry out some form of military action. A full-scale invasion of Ukraine is clearly possible when you have assembled a force of that size, but it would be, I think, a massive miscalculation by Putin. I think the downside of an invasion, which we can discuss further if you want, but it's fairly obvious, would be huge. And I'm not just talking about sanctions. I'm talking about the issues that arise if you try to occupy a country larger than France, population of over 40 million, that doesn't want to be occupied. And I think that would be a disaster for Russia. They should have had enough experience, and indeed others have had experience of occupations, no names, no pact drill, no mention of Iraq, to show that this is a pretty hazardous thing to do. So I think it's more likely that we're now in what will probably be a pretty lengthy phase in which Russia will use a number of different tactics to ramp up the pressure and to try to work on any fissures that the Russians can perceive both within Ukraine and within the Western alliance. On a more optimistic front, if we are to make progress diplomatically, I think the critical thing now will be the way that messages get exchanged quietly between, above all, Moscow and Washington. Washington clearly speaking to a coordinated Western position, continuing to do what Washington has been doing very well, which is linking up with the European allies. And one recalls that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the critical factor in working for a solution was a very quiet diplomacy conducted by Robert Kennedy, RFK, with the Russian ambassador Dobrynin, which very few people even knew about. So I hope that some messages are going quietly between Washington and Moscow, but of course, I have absolutely no knowledge of what is passing down that channel. And let me conclude with a thought that was voiced by Winston Churchill in 1918 when he was advising cabinet colleagues on the attitude to be taken to Russia after the revolution and during the period of Western intervention. Churchill wrote in a memo, "We may abandon Russia, but Russia will not abandon us. The bear is padding on bloody paws across the snow to the peace conference." Well, Putin's paws certainly are bloody. He has an enormous amount of blood on his paws. Whether he is yet padding across the snow towards a negotiation, I think is too soon to tell. But when you look at his personal position, which is where I started, he's taken a considerable risk. He's not by any means as strong in the saddle as he once was. The rockiest point of his 22 years in power was when he miscalculated policy towards Ukraine at the time of the Orange Revolution. He got that really badly wrong. It was a personal humiliation for him. And for 3 or 4 months after that, his position was quite wobbly, and people around Moscow were speculating openly that he might not make it to the next presidential election 3 years later. If this current episode goes badly for Putin, that is to say, if he cannot convince his own people that his tactics have produced what he can call a victory for Russia, his position in Moscow, his standing in Moscow will take a hit. I'm not forecasting his demise, but I am saying that he is playing for pretty high stakes. And whatever happens now, whatever happens over the next year, 2, 3 years, the remainder of Putin's reign, I'm absolutely certain of one thing. A generation hence, Russian historians will be marking Putin down as the man who lost Ukraine. And there, I think, Steve, I will pause and let's have a discussion.
Great. That's a fantastic introduction to the topic. Let me pose 1 or 2 questions to start things off. First of all, you described Putin's paranoia and this paranoia in his inner circle that NATO is out to get Russia, that color revolutions are not manifestations of public discontent with stolen elections or authoritarianism, but they're organized by our CIA and your MI6. How much of that is paranoia that they really believe it? And how much of that is the narrative that they're trying to shape of sort of this long list of Russian grievances inflicted upon it by the West?
I think it's a mixture of the two, and I think it depends who we're talking of. I mean, if we take Nikolai Patrushev, with whom I had 1 or 2 interesting exchanges when I was in Moscow, when I look at everything he says, I think this man is deeply, deeply paranoid. And Patrushev was padding the streets of St. Petersburg, Leningrad, as it then was, with Putin in the internal branch of the KGB in the 1970s, cracking the heads of dissidents and probably chasing after CIA spies. And I think, people have a tendency sometimes to believe their own propaganda. When the Orange Revolution happened in Kiev, when the Rosa Revolution happened in Georgia, these were very disturbing events for people in the Kremlin. Popular protests overthrowing regimes, it's not a good example. And they needed to find an explanation that suited their own book. And I think they could find that non-governmental organizations from the United States or Britain or Poland had supported democracy. Our politicians were all, of course, very obviously favoring the orange side, favoring Democrats everywhere, as they do, and put 2 and 2 together and say, these people are ganging up on us. I think there was also, going back to 9/11, I think Putin had hoped, when he gave very strong support to George W. Bush, first person to call him on 9/11, offered help in getting American forces out to Afghanistan and so on. Putin, I think, was hoping to leverage that into the Russian conflict in Chechnya, which has been another failure for Putin, I may say, being regarded by us, classified by us, as part of the global war on terror. But we didn't fall for that one. But he was trying to present it in that way. When that didn't happen, we then saw first Patrushev, then Surkov, then Putin at different times, suggesting quite absurdly, I mean farcically, that American and British special services had been assisting the Chechen terrorists as part of this mythical plot to dismember Russia. When Putin gave this press conference on the 23rd of December, harking back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, he was suggesting that breaking it into 12 parts wasn't enough for us. We had wanted to break it into many more parts than that. Well, actually, we hadn't, but Yeltsin and the people around Yeltsin at some point toyed with the idea of dividing the Russian Federation, because it was so large, into a number of smaller units. It wasn't a Western plot, it was a Russian plot. So I think there is a real element of paranoia fused with hostility. That said, nobody in the Russian general staff, no Russian intelligence analyst, can seriously believe that NATO has either the capability or the intention to attack Russia. They can see that that is not the case. Likewise, they know perfectly well, as does the Ukrainian leadership, that there is no question of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO for the foreseeable future, if ever. I mean, this has been a dead letter for 14 years since the Bucharest Declaration of NATO in 2008. And they understand that perfectly well. Of course, they want NATO publicly to declare that. And of course, NATO cannot publicly declare that because that would be a breach of the open door policy. And it would be a breach of the long held principle that it's not for Russia to veto membership of NATO. But that's why I say I don't think NATO is the real issue. I think that the sphere of influence and control of Ukraine is absolutely the core objective.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me go. Ann Clunan asked a question, which was going to be my second question as well. She's at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. Is there a face-saving way out for Putin? Would an agreement or a negotiation on intermediate range missiles and ballistic missile defense and risk reduction measures, would that offer a path? And if so, and my question would be is, that's what's on offer, I think, from the United States and NATO. But why does he continue? Even today, the Russians are saying yes, but they have to go back and pay attention to our key demands, which are no NATO enlargement, and that NATO withdraw forces from the territory of those allies who joined after 1997.
Well, I think it's a matter of real concern if they are continuing to demand two things that they know not to be negotiable. This, if taken literally, suggests that they are not really interested in engaging with negotiation. Yes, I mean, there are avenues that Putin could go down that certainly would save face, and they were essentially set out in the US and NATO response to Russia, and they fall into three categories. We are absolutely willing to discuss a whole raft of issues to do with strategic stability and European security. We are willing to discuss the relationship between Russia and NATO and to seek to stabilize that. And we are certainly interested in making progress, as indeed the French and Germans have been trying to do through the Normandy process, making progress towards a settlement of this conflict on Ukraine's eastern borders. I think there's one other element that might appeal to the Russians if they wanted a visible success. They have, for years and years, and this was happening when I was still serving in Moscow, now 18 years ago, been very preoccupied with American theater missile defense installations being put into Poland and Romania. They have never really accepted the logic that the United States needed this to protect against strategic missiles or strategic nuclear armed missiles being fired at the United States from Iran. The American argument has been, well, this is no disruption of strategic stability between the United States and Russia because Russian missiles aimed at the United States wouldn't fly over Poland and Romania. They go over the ice cap and they come up from under the sea. So why are you worried about it? And the reason why the Russians are worried about it is because once those installations exist, as they now, I think, do, the Russian argument is they could very quickly be converted into bases for cruise missiles that would reach Russia within a matter of minutes. I think that some agreement that neutralized that issue would be seen as a win for Putin. Now, I think the Americans have offered mutual inspection and verification of potentially threatening intermediate missile facilities and missile defense facilities. And there's an awful lot that would be in it for Russia if we went back into a new INF agreement and quite possibly a new agreement on conventional forces. I think they're looking at this at the moment, but they're not yet suggesting, and this is early in the game, fairly early in the game, or not at the end of the game, that there's enough in it to attract them. So I think we need to be patient. We need to maintain very, very clearly the deterrent measures to try to deter them from taking military action. And we have set out a path.
Thank you. Okay, question from my colleague here at CSAC, Rose Gottemoeller, who her last official position was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO. She says, what do you think of the commentary by independent or so-called independent critics from the retired military and the KGB? Not only General Ivashov, but also people like Ivashov. Do you think that those are really independent commentaries? Is it the Kremlin using them, or is the Kremlin using them to help shape the media environment in both Russia and abroad? Or let me offer a third possibility. In the case of Ivashov, might he be a mouthpiece for serving Russian military officers, senior officers, who understand that a military operation against Ukraine would be perhaps more difficult than it might be thought of in the Kremlin?
I think this is really interesting. I mean, Ivashov's letter, written on behalf of this relatively small association of former officers, was a very striking one. And he's doubled down on that. He's given television interviews, he's given newspaper interviews since he wrote the letter. And, you know, he was a very senior, very influential general. I think it's a bridge too far to think that this is some very clever Kremlin conspiracy. I think the key question here is, to what extent does he reflect a strand of opinion in the Russian armed forces? Now, some people have said, well, he's just an old retired general and there are only 30 or 50 people in his organization, and we shouldn't over-exaggerate the significance. There have been 2 or 3 others coming out on similar lines. But I think it's not wholly unrealistic, though this is pure guesswork on any of our parts, to think that Ivashov is articulating a view held by senior people in the Russian military, because I think Putin has issued 2 sets of orders. In order to make a credible threat, he has told the military to go and prepare to invade Ukraine and to make all the necessary plans. And that is what they're doing. And then he's issued another set of orders, essentially to his intelligence services and his diplomats, to go off and destabilize Ukraine and disrupt the West and do a bit of talking, but not too much, and help to maximize the confusion. Now, if you're in the Russian military and you've had this order and you've had this incredibly serious buildup, and then you look at the task that you would be asked to carry out if there was a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, you might well say, look, this is pretty crazy idea. This is going to go very badly wrong. You might not be very keen to go in and kill a lot of Ukrainians, not least because a lot of these Ukrainian officers are people who you or your junior officers were serving with, or whose fathers you served with, or to whom you are related in some shape or form, or with whom you have drunk a lot of vodka over the years, because, you know, the relationship between the Russian army and the Ukrainian army remained pretty close for a long time after the end of the Soviet Union. So I think, you know, it's not absurd to see that Ivashov's letter represents some pushback from the military, just as one is seeing quite a lot of pushback in any opinion polling, and there have been a few, trying to assess the attitude of the wider Russian public towards a war with Ukraine, And of course, one sees it, as you will have seen, Steve, I'm sure, in one's exchanges with some of the Russian political commentariat, who can see the risks in all of this. So I think this is not negligible, but it's almost impossible sitting in London or in California really to have one's finger on the pulse in Moscow.
Okay. Just a fact check question here. Peter Chu asked that you mentioned that Putin's explicit reference to just the 12 former Soviet republics, not 15. And I would agree. I think the Russians and then Putin understand that the Baltic states are in fact in NATO, in the European Union, are lost. But the question was, where and when did Putin make that statement?
In his very long annual news conference on the 23rd of December.
Okay, great. Okay,
it was sort of embedded in a statement about Western plots to dismember Russia.
Okay. All right, a question from Scott Sagan, who's the co-director of CSAC here. He notes that American journalist Walter Pincus has talked about how the Biden administration has used or tried to help deter a Russian attack on Ukraine by putting out a lot of information that in the past would have been kept secret, a lot of intelligence data out there. And he refers to this as deterrence by disclosure. The British government has been saying some things as well. Can you comment on how Britain has played in that role and how it's being implemented and what impact you think it has had?
Well, I haven't been privy to any of the discussions that led to this disclosure, and it is a bit of a departure from past practice. And clearly it's been pretty well coordinated, as one would expect, between London and Washington, given the strength of the intelligence alliance. And I think it's been quite carefully calculated. I think there's a good political reason for doing it, in that if you're the US president or the British prime minister, and people wake up one morning and find the Russians have invaded Ukraine and you knew it was going to happen, but you had not prepared public opinion for that, then immediately you're going to be under attack for being asleep at the switch and not knowing what's going on and where the hell were your intelligence people. But I think it's also intended to undermine the plots that are very likely being made as part of the war planning on the other side, to stage incidents in Ukraine. I think it's intended slightly to dramatize the situation. It's been criticized, of course, by President Zelensky and by some people in Western Europe as overdone, overdramatic, withdrawal of embassy staff, all of that sort of stuff, withdrawal of the American embassy to Lviv. On the balance of advantage, it seems to me that making people aware that this is really serious, that this is potentially the most serious security crisis in Europe since the Second World War, has got to be the right thing to do. I think we in this country are a bit slow to wake up to this. Really, our political leadership, with the exception of the chief of the defense staff and the defense minister, but at the level of the foreign ministry and the prime minister's office, really didn't seem to be paying any attention to it until end of January, beginning of February. But this thing has been bubbling up since the autumn, and certainly from the 17th of December was becoming really serious. So I think it was a belated recognition that people had to be aware of the state of this, and they had to gear themselves for its possible consequences, because were an invasion to happen, then everybody in Europe, particularly in Europe, would suffer, but I mean also the United States, things that hit people in their pocket. I mean, we're already having to increase our defense spending. Last year saw the largest increase in European defense spending for many years, and a very big one in this country. But it would hit our financial markets. We've seen the stock markets gyrating, as they will do in a situation like this. Energy prices are already at an extremely high level in Europe, but they would go even higher. There would be a great likelihood of a wave of migration from Eastern Europe to a Europe that is already struggling with waves of migration, particularly across the Mediterranean, and some of which coming across the Channel. So I think it's really important to, sensitize public opinion before the event. If it doesn't happen, great, but better to be that way around.
Okay. John Sagan has asked one question, which I'm actually going to break into two. And that is that if the Russian military did in fact invade Ukraine and occupied a significant chunk of Ukrainian territory, how likely do you assess that there would be a guerrilla type resistance against that occupation? And then second, if there was that kind of guerrilla resistance, would that cause a problem for Putin domestically, and how big a problem?
I think there'd be resistance in lots of ways. I mean, I think the first point is that while I haven't been in Ukraine recently, and therefore I'm not best placed to assess this, it's pretty clear that the Ukrainians have geared up to resist militarily. There would be significant casualties. They couldn't, of course, hold out indefinitely against the Russian forces, but they would fight. That's the first point. Then if the Russians succeeded in occupying, they'd be very stretched to do this, Ukraine, I think they would face a wave of civil disobedience. There would be demonstrations, there would be strikes, there would be some random acts of violence. There would be a lot of non-cooperation from a very large percentage of the Ukrainian population. I mean, 90% at least of the people of Ukraine would not want them there. Let us remember that every single region of Ukraine, including Crimea, voted in a free referendum on the 1st of December 1991 for independence. So the notion that there are large numbers of people in Ukraine who would prefer to be ruled by Moscow rather than Kiev is, I think, false. And if Putin believes that, then he's deluding himself. Would there be guerrilla resistance? Well, after the Second World War in Western Ukraine, which of course had not been part of the Soviet Union before the war, but was part of Poland as Galicia, partisans continued to fight against Stalin's forces for several years after the war. It took the Russians quite a long time to mop up a guerrilla movement then. Whether that would happen again or not, I'm not qualified to say. But if it did happen, it would be most likely to happen in the Western Ukraine.
And the impact on that kind of resistance on Russian public opinion?
I think the impact on Russian public opinion of body bags of Russian soldiers coming back from fighting Ukrainians would itself be quite significant, particularly if those body bags came back in large numbers. And remember that a lot of Russian mothers only have one son. They don't have big families. This would be almost a civil war. Putin has defined the people of Ukraine in his famous essay and in many public statements as one people with Russia. Not really, he said, Ukraine is not a foreign country. It's part of Russia. So if he fights part of Russia, he's killing fellow citizens in his own estimation. I don't think killing Ukrainians is popular with Russians. I mean, these are Slavic brothers. About 3/4 of the religious believers in Ukraine are Orthodox. There's huge intermarriage. A number of the Ukrainian citizens killed would be ethnic Russians. These are not people who were hostile to Russia, with, I think, the partial exception of the Western Ukrainians. And I think the Russian public, and there's quite a lot of evidence already to suggest this, as I say, from polling, would hate the idea of waging war on Ukraine. That's one of the reasons why the Kremlin has to present this as a war against NATO. It's not a war against Ukraine, it's a war against NATO. It's the sort of pitch that they are trying to justify their position. But it would be a war against Ukraine. You could justify to the Russian public a need to kill people that you classified as Islamist terrorists in Chechnya, or for that matter, in Syria. But I think killing Ukrainians will be a very different thing. Then, if it turned out that this wasn't some wonderful success, but was a continuing source of trouble, much worse actually than Afghanistan, and that was bad enough, then that would become increasingly unpopular with the Russian people. And I think that would be dangerous personally for Putin. That's why I say I think he's playing for very high stakes here. And you know, if you do the math, it's very hard to see how he, if he calculates correctly, will believe that a full-scale invasion and occupation of Ukraine is going to play well for him.
Okay. Yesterday we saw the vote in the Duma calling on President Putin to consider recognizing the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as independent states. And I think the Kremlin has sort of turned that aside for now. But Russ Order asks, how likely is that Russia would in fact want to annex those portions of occupied Donbass?
Well, it's another tactic in a sort of hybrid war. They did choose to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It's not been a great success. Nobody else joined them in that. Very few people have actually recognized the annexation of Crimea. And it would automatically bring the Minsk process to an end. It would not achieve what the Russians have been hoping to achieve through the Minsk negotiations, which is to have a foothold in the Ukrainian parliament, and through that, under the Ukrainian constitution, as they would wish it to be amended, to have the ability to have a sort of blocking vote in Kiev. So it wouldn't achieve any of that. And it would create yet another rather awkward precedent for Russia. There's 1.5 million square kilometers of the Russian Far East, the Russian Far Eastern provinces, essentially, that the Chinese believe historically belong to China rather than Russia. And I think Putin needs to be a little bit careful not to pile up too many precedents for annexing territory across internationally recognized boundaries. Now, nobody talks about this in Russia at the moment because the official line has to be that relations with China have never been better in 300 years. And people don't talk about the Treaty of Aigun, I think it was in 1858, under which China, under Emperor Qing, when he was quite weak, was forced by the Russians to cede this territory to China. But the Chinese, to Russia, sorry, the Chinese have a long-term aspiration to regain that territory. It's one of the unreturned territories of China, a long way beyond Taiwan. And we're not talking about, you know, this decade or the next decade. It's a long way, I'm sure, down the track. But it's somewhere in the back of everybody's mind. So I think there's a whole load of reasons why it would be a tactical error to do this, but that's not to say that they're not going to do it.
Okay. David Holloway here at CSAC on the China asked the questions where I think you've already sort of hinted at the answer, but he said, you talked about the passive support that Putin is now receiving from Xi. Do you think there are limits to the kind of support that China would give if in fact there's an escalation, and what are those limits?
I really don't know. I think, you know, this is the purest guesswork that might have passed between Putin and Xi. I don't think that the Chinese would want this to develop into a very messy situation, let alone a conspicuous failure for Russia. The Chinese have been playing their own games in Eastern Europe. I mean, including investing in Ukraine, but they have developed this 17+1 process as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it stretches all the way up to Belarus. And in a way, the Chinese have been encircling Russia. You know, the BRI runs through Central Asia, runs around Russia's borders, but now it has its tentacles out in Eastern Europe, including in Ukraine. And you know, there is a substantial Chinese investment in that, in trying to draw some of these countries closer to China or into a Chinese orbit, or give China some leverage in them. And a major conflict in Ukraine could cut across that by consolidating, as it has already done, NATO and the Western orientation of some countries that are, how shall I put it, a little bit flaky. I have Hungary as one very obvious example. So I think, you know, the Chinese have to think rather carefully about this. And I don't think I know nearly enough about what's in President Xi's minds to give a really educated answer. I'm sure your experts have a much better idea than I have.
Okay. Perry Bloom asks, how are Putin's actions towards Ukraine likely to affect the attitude in Finland, and I would also add, and in Sweden, towards pursuing NATO membership?
Well, his actions have already put the question on the agenda in both of those countries, which is interesting. I would be surprised if the Finns went all the way. I think they'd be fairly cautious about it. But this already demonstrates the downside of Putin's behavior. The way that he has consolidated the West, the way that for the first time in years and years, he has caused a serious debate to happen in Sweden, and particularly, curiously, in Finland, about NATO membership. And that's another reason why I don't think Russian history is going to look very kindly on what Mr. Putin did for his country. I don't think I would forecast at this stage that they would join. As I say, I think it unlikely that Finland would do that. But they'll certainly, I think, increase their links with NATO, not least because of the very close connections that both Finland and Sweden have with the Baltic states.
Okay. Question from Ed If, which is, if the Minsk agreements no longer prove feasible as a way to resolve the situation in eastern Ukraine, do you see any kind of outline or any kind of approach that in fact would lead to a solution of that conflict?
It is a soluble conflict. I mean, we are not talking about Israel and Palestine. One could, I think, if you had a Russian negotiator who had full powers and a reasonable approach, and a Ukrainian likewise, perhaps with a bit of brokerage from elsewhere, you could map out a settlement of that conflict that would involve withdrawal of forces on both sides. It would involve monitoring of the border by an international peacekeeping force, possibly from the UN, possibly from the OSCE. Both of these ideas have been floated. Neither has been, I think, comprehensively shot down. It would involve a greater degree of federalization in Ukraine, which I think the Ukrainians would not wish to apply solely to Donetsk and Lugansk, but not to the extent demanded by Russia. And I think that would have to follow, and this is, I think, critical to the Minsk process and one of the reasons why it has not succeeded, the withdrawal of forces. All of that is perfectly feasible if you had the political will on both sides to settle. This is not one of the world's insoluble problems at all. It's not only suited Russia to keep it going for all of these years in the hope of keeping Ukraine weak, which has certainly been one of Putin's objectives, but in a slightly cynical way, one could argue that it has also not been unhelpful for Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has not been the best governed country on earth over the last 30 years. And the Ukrainian economy has been very weak, and Ukrainians have frequently gone cap in hand to Western institutions for bailouts. And we have not turned around and said, look, sorry, guys, until you sort yourselves out, you're on your own. Because particularly since 2014, we have felt a need to support Ukraine because it is under attack from Russia. And that's been quite a useful excuse, if you like, for Ukrainian leaders and Ukrainian policymakers not to sort their own house out. Because when push comes to shove, they can turn up in Washington, they can turn up in European capitals or in Brussels and bang on the door and saying, well, we're in trouble because Russia is being beastly to us. And unless you write us another check, we're going to go down the tubes, and you don't want that. So there is, I think, a lack of political will to some extent on both sides to settle this. And it certainly should not be settled on the basis of the Minsk II proposals, because essentially they were drafted far too much in Russia's favor, and I think would be very harmful to Ukraine and to Ukraine's sovereignty.
Okay. Shmuel Schaffer asks, how much of the Russian effort to manufacture this crisis over the past 3 or 4 months has been driven by economic considerations? Because we have seen the price of oil go up, we have seen the price of gas go up. That means more revenues. How big of a factor is that in Kremlin thinking?
I think it's a small factor, not a big factor. The Russian economy is underperforming, but they do have this very large reserve of over $600 billion to draw on, so they're not in dire trouble at the moment. They've got to be very careful. I mean, obviously, oil can be sold anywhere at world prices, and for a number of years, it suited Russia to have a high oil price, and they've often been in an argument with Saudi Arabia about where that should be. But they need to be careful over gas, because gas is a double-edged weapon. Yes, they would cause a lot of pain in Europe, and particularly in Germany, by cutting off gas. They could withstand within Russia the loss of revenue for a while, but gas is their largest export earner by volume, by value, and is a very important component of the Russian state budget. And the molecules of gas that they sell to Western Europe cannot easily be transported elsewhere. The pipeline that goes into China, and I think there is only one at this moment, goes from the Kvitka field near Lake Baikal in eastern Siberia. The molecules that come to Europe come from the Yamal Peninsula and from western Siberia, and you can't send them by pipe to China or anywhere else. You can turn some of them into LNG at the Yamal LNG terminal, but that is not a huge terminal, and it's probably working fairly near to capacity at the moment, though I'm not by any means an expert on that subject. So the risk to Russia, I mean, the prices may be high, but if they can't sell the gas, then they're going to have a hole in their finances. So they need to be a little bit careful over the gas.
All right. Question from Roosevelt Boyland. The Russians have built up this large military presence around Ukraine. How long do you think they can sustain that military pressure? And really, how long can they keep those troops in the field before they either have to make a decision to actually use them and assault Ukraine, or basically take the forces back to their normal garrisons?
Well, you'd need to put that question to a military expert to get an authentic answer. Clearly, if you are deploying overseas, your ability to sustain a mobilization is pretty time limited, and that was a big factor in the timing of the Iraq war. If you're deploying on home territory, you can sustain it for very much longer. And you can use roulement of forces. You don't have to necessarily keep whatever they've got now, whether it's 100 or 120 or 150,000 troops there permanently in order to apply this pressure. They have actually brought a significant number of forces from the Russian Far East, the first time they've done that since the Second World War. And at some point, some of these troops will need to be rotated, and you'll send some of them home and bring others in. But as they're on home turf, as they're using internal supply lines, as they've got fairly good rail connections and road connections, my uneducated, unmilitary guess is that they could sustain a high level of mobilization on Ukraine's frontiers for a pretty long time to come, because basically what they've done is they've shuffled the disposition of forces within their own country, and that's very, very different from deploying a force outside.
Okay. Yeah, I just might add briefly, I heard someone else also comment is they could also send the troops home back to garrison, but simply leave the equipment there pre-positioned for a return at some point.
Yeah,
I think we have time for one more question. This comes from Mary Steiner, which is talking about President Biden was pretty clear in his press conference with Chancellor Scholz that if the Russians do invade, Nord Stream 2 is a dead issue. Now, I read that to believe either President Biden knows that Berlin will shut the pipeline down, or if not, then the United States is prepared to sanction it to death. How big of a factor do you think that Nord Stream 2 pipeline and its potential loss is in the calculations in the Kremlin?
Not critical. I think it's at the level of a substantial irritant, but it's a very long way from being a showstopper. But what we're talking about is potentially a Russian operation, a Russian offensive on a large Russian active aggression on a larger scale than anything that we have seen in modern times. And if our talk of reacting to this in a very serious way is to have any meaning, then we would have to adopt the sort of sanctions that hurt them and hurt us. And it seems to me, in circumstances in which Russia had actually invaded Ukraine, that it would be completely untenable for the Germans to open Nord Stream 2. I mean, the pipeline exists. You don't have to dismantle it, but you simply would not open it up and start buying gas through it at a time when Russia had invaded Ukraine. And surely German public opinion at that point would feel so strongly that it could be persuaded to put up with the undoubted hardship of doing without Russian gas supplies. It's not dependent at the moment on Nord Stream 2. It is getting gas through Nord Stream 1. But there are alternative sources of supply, including from the United States and Qatar. And Europe would need to help out in different ways. So the French get gas from North Africa, so do the Italians. Quite a lot of gas comes from Norway. You could probably pump a bit more. We can squeeze a tiny bit out of the North Sea. There would have to be a mass effort, because this would be such an offensive action by Russia. And Germany is a lot closer to Ukraine than we are in Britain. you would think that the shock effect there would be pretty substantial, and that public opinion would say, well, we've got to show that we're serious about this. The Germans don't have a lot of military force that they can deploy in that area. They've been a bit hesitant about military equipment, but I think at that point, the mood would surely change. I can't envisage a situation in which the Germans open Nord Stream 2 while Russia invades Ukraine. It just seems to me to be inconceivable. Maybe I'm being unrealistic, but that's the way it feels from here.
Okay. Well, Sir Roderic, thank you very much. You have covered a lot of ground. I think you've given us a lot to think about as we watch how this crisis plays out. Were we sitting around the conference table here at Encina Hall at Stanford, I would invite a well-deserved round of applause. Zoom doesn't allow us to do that, but let me just thank you for taking the time to do this. It's been really informative and very useful for us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Steve.
All right. Take care now. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.